What's going on, YouTube? We're back at it for another video, and today we've got the best automatons loadout, as we do need to take out 2 planets in order to maintain some type of supremacy over the automatons and build some type of space stations that will further advance our super Earth hold in this portion of the galaxy as we make our way over to Cyberstan and eliminate the threat for good. But with the most recent patch, there's been a change up to the most important stratagems and support weapons that can be the most beneficial for you when it comes to facing off with the automatons, so I thought I'd revisit my best in slot automatons loadout, and more than a few things have changed. But this loadout's going to be a powerful one. It's going to be one that a lot of people more than likely can wield with a little bit of ease, and it's going to be clearing through most of the content that you'll be facing off with the automatons, and give you a little bit of an answer for just about any situation you may be facing, and a good bit of survivability as well. With that being said, we've got more than a few things to cover, so let's get straight into it, starting off with the stratagems you'll need in order to build out this loadout. Starting off first with our first stratagem, we've got the Railgun, which has gotten a significant power increase with its damage output and its durability damage. Now when it comes down to the capabilities of the Railgun when it comes to facing off with the automatons, we'll start off with some of these smaller fries, which are going to be the Devastators, which now, with even in safe mode, a full charge is going to one-tap any one of the Devastators you may be facing off with, including those meat saws. The only one that might be a little bit of a tricky problem to deal with is going to be the Heavy Devastator with the shield, so you'll need to aim a little bit high and up to the left, or at least towards the backpack on them, just above their shield, in order to get that one-shot capability. Otherwise, if you're aiming for the shield, sadly enough, even at a full overcharge of almost 90%, if not over, you won't be pushing through that shield. It will have enough durability to diminish the actual damage output of the shot, if not almost completely stop it from actually damaging that Heavy Devastator. So do keep that in mind and make sure that you go for the fleshy bits, or in this case, the softer metal behind the solid steel. You will also be able to one-shot the new Striders that are heavily armored that have the rockets on the side of them, which can be extremely frustrating to deal with, but thankfully with the full charge of the Railgun, we'll be able to just one-shot them by shooting them in their little carriage ride on top and make quick work of them. And just after that, when it comes down to facing off with Hulks, we'll still have that one-shot capability by hitting the little red visor in the center of their chest. But besides being able to one-shot the face of the Hulk, you will also be able to one-shot any one of the limbs as long as you're overcharging the weapon in unsafe mode up to 90%. You'll be able to take off any one of the legs or the arms, which the arms can be particularly more important, especially with one of the changes to the Hulks, where it now has that cannon turret that you may have all faced off with, that laser that's at the fortresses in Super Helldive that can be extremely frustrating to deal with and seems to have massive amounts of force behind it, to the point where it is going straight through walls or some type of solid rock structure just to blow you back onto the ground. And being able to take out that arm can be a huge benefit to you and the team, as that thing is extremely devastating, fires off 4 times, and the laser Gatling arm they have on the other side is just as deadly, but not as frustrating as that massive laser cannon arm it has on the other side. I would literally prefer to have the rockets back with any one of these Hulks at this point, as that thing is just overpowered. But thankfully with the Railgun and the overcharge, we'll be able to take out that arm pretty easily. And just after that, when it comes down to having the capability of one-shotting, you will be able to one-shot any one of the emplacements around the map. This includes any one of the anti-aircraft or the mortars, or possibly those pesky laser turrets that we have found at the fortresses in Super Helldive. With an overcharge upwards of 90% within that unsafe mode, you will be able to one-tap any one of these, and it makes destroying these encampments extremely easy, especially from a distance. You'll be able to just pick these off and make sure that you're still able to use those eagles, or possibly just take care of those mortars before they just consistently bombard you, and it can be extremely irritating in those moments. But thankfully, the Railgun is going to be making quick work out of any one of those encampments you may be facing off with in some of those dives you're taking. And the last thing we'll be able to one-shot is going to be the engines of any one of the gunships. Thankfully, the Railgun has finally been brought up to the point where it does not take about 20 shots just to take down a gunship. We're finally at the point where we're one-tapping each one of these out of the sky, as long as you're getting that overcharge with the unsafe mode over into just one singular engine. Sometimes it can be a little bit tricky with the sight that we have on this, but if you play around with it for some time, you'll eventually start knocking these out like cakewalk. And it feels so satisfying to be able to one-tap those things out of the sky, especially how they used to bully us with all those rockets and lasers before. And when it comes down to the heavily armored tanks, both the Gatling and the cannon turret type one, you do not want to shoot these from the front. They have now improved the armor on the front of both of these heavily armored tanks, and they will ricochet every single time, even in overcharge, all the way up to almost exploding the Railgun. this shot will always ricochet off the front of any one of the heavily armored tanks, so you will need to get to the back of the cannon turret top in order to hit that exposed weak spot, or softer metal technically, on the back side of it, and generally it'll take about 6 fully charged shots in order to take down any one of those cannon turrets, or those cannon turrets that may be across the map besides the heavily armored tanks themselves. And one tip to throw out there is all you need to do is hit the back corners of this. You don't need to hit the yellow vents directly on the back. The entire back side of it is the portion that is going to be technically the exposed weak spot, or the spot that has the softer metal on it. So that is where you'll want to land all those shots, and you don't technically have to be all the way at the back end of them, or at least hitting that dead center of the back in order to get maximum damage on this and finish it off as quick as possible. And last but not least, the railgun does have the capability of taking down the factory strider. It's not exactly the most efficient route, but one of the great things about the railgun is with 3 overcharged shots, you can take off the cannon that's on top of the factory strider, and with any one of those charged shots, you can take out those little miniguns at the front of the little head of the factory strider that can be probably one of the most devastating forces, and just chew through anybody that just runs out of cover, at least in front of it. But if you can take those 3 things out, you will also be capable of landing shots on the little red lens that's on the left side of the face of this factory strider. And if you land 6 shots directly into that one spot, you will be able to blow it up. It's not exactly the most ideal thing, and you definitely want to take out the guns on the front of it and the cannon on top, and it's one of those moments where it's a pretty small spot to hit, so if you've got enemies around you and you don't have a clear line of sight while you're charging that, it could possibly end up either just being a frustrating time, if not just ending up making you take more shots if you just can't get that full charge every time, or miss a couple of times. But the railgun does have the capability of taking down that factory strider. The railgun has had a massive damage increase, and it is a much more powerful force against the automatons now. I'm loving it. I am whipping this thing around, destroying any one of those devastators, ripping through those hulks, and making sure I'm just destroying every one of those encampments. It feels a whole lot better than it did before, and it feels so good to knock out those gunships in the sky easily and just one tapping away. But overall, I believe that the railgun is now outshining the laser cannon and the auto cannon to the point where it does have capabilities of finishing off a lot of the units you'll be facing off with a lot quicker and a lot more efficiently than those other 2 support weapons. They're still doing great, and they've had their buffs that have enhanced their capability, but the railgun, if you can get that aim down and you can land those shots and do it with that overcharge, it's going to get the job done the easiest. And even if you're somebody that doesn't want to utilize the overcharge and keeps this in safe mode, it still does have the capability of still one-shotting those devastators as well as one-shotting those hulks. So even if you don't feel comfortable in unsafe mode, the damage increase and that durability damage increase has brought this in line with being something that is going to be a powerful force at taking out both the devastators and the hulks, and still giving you the capability of taking down those gunships relatively quickly. But I would highly suggest getting comfortable with the unsafe mode, as it's going to be the biggest benefit for you. Coming up right after that for a second stratagem, it's going to be the supply pack. That way we'll be able to stock ourselves with plenty of ammo for our railgun, as well as our primary weapon, our throwables, and giving us those syringes back every single time, increasing our overall survivability and maintaining that ammo over time, as it's pretty easy to burn through the ammo of the railgun at this point, especially if you're just one-tapping Devastator after Devastator and then working through those hulks. If you've got a lot of different bot drops coming in, you're going to be burning through those 20 rounds pretty quickly. This is where the supply pack is really going to come in handy and give us the capability of dishing out a large amount of that railgun ammunition and just having a good time overall, as well as increasing that survivability with how many stems we'll need with how many rockets we may be getting ragdolled with. Coming up right after that, when it comes down to our third stratagem, we're going to be popping in the Rocket Sentry. The Rocket Sentry has come up to be one of the better sentries out of the game, and it is one that is great for crowd control and single target damage. With a large amount of ammunition in this, the biggest thing to note about the sentries is it's all about placement. You definitely don't want to throw this out into the chaos. You want to make sure that you plan where you're actually going to put this, and I would highly suggest trying to find some type of high ground or some type of vantage point for your Rocket Sentry. You don't even need to be necessarily right next to it. You can just throw this off to the side anytime that you have one of those bot drops coming in, or if you're moving up on the next objective or one of the bases that you'll need to take out the fabricators with. This can be one of those perfect opportunities to find one of those spots to put the Rocket Sentry, have it provide a little bit of overwatch. It's going to be clearing through those devastators, and with some of the ship module upgrades, it finally now is able to basically eat quite a few rockets and ammunition from some of those devastators, so it's not going to get knocked out all that quickly. But with the railgun, we'll also be able to protect it in some of those moments if a Hulk starts charging it, or possibly some other units. Generally, if you're using the explosive crossbow or the railgun and you're firing at the devastators, you will pull the aggro of these devastators, and the rocket sentries going to basically help you as to bombard them with rockets, take out the Hulk super quickly. It even can be something that benefits us facing off with the factory striders or even with the heavily armored tanks, and it has the damage capability of taking them out fairly quickly as well. But overall, the rocket sentry is one of those that just ends up giving us a little bit of a benefit and almost one of those one-man army moments in some of those bot drops, as if you place this properly, it is going to bombard a large portion of any one of those devastators and groups of Hulks you may be facing off with, stunning and damaging them, and destroy those groups before they can even advance on you or your team. Now, that's not always going to work out perfectly, but if you do get that placement right, it can be a huge benefit. And a lot of times it can almost last all the way up until its cooldown is up. It's almost very similar to the mortar EMS with how many rounds it has available, and if it can survive for its full lifetime, it generally will last all the way up until the next one is available. And one last thing to mention is that it will also be able to take down some of those drop ships as well as taking down some of those gunships, so it has a little bit of that anti-air quality to it as well. You just can't go wrong with a rocket sentry. And coming up last but not least, we're going with the 500 kg bomb. We're looking at that big boom. We're looking to just basically annihilate certain targets with this one, and more specifically the 500 kg is going to be our simple answer for taking out any one of those factory striders, as with two of these we will be able to take them down fairly quickly, or at least with just one of them we'll be able to cut the amount of damage we'll need to take them down in about half. And generally you'll find a lot of people will have some type of other eagle stratagem such as the airstrike or orbital precision strike in order to follow up with that 500 kg and finish that off extremely quickly. But at the same time, the 500 kg does have the capability of a little bit of crowd control. We can throw these off into the bases, and with this recent patch increasing the blast radius of this to match the visual radius that it has, it can be quite dangerous now, so do make sure that you back up quite a distance from that drop. But it is much more noticeable at how much damage and devastation it can cause. And on top of that, the last thing to note about the 500 kg bomb is something that some people may not know about, but when it comes down to those detection towers, those eyes of Sauron, they can be a real nuisance at bringing in a lot of bot drops, almost an unlimited amount of bot drops if you're stuck in that eye for quite a long time before you're able to take it out. But with the 500 kg bomb, if you're able to sneak around and underneath that eye of Sauron, you'll be able to toss this in over and it'll immediately destroy it. You'll no longer need a hell bomb for this. You can also get this done with the orbital precision strike, but it seems a bit easier to get done with the 500 kg bomb. But this is one of the benefits of coming in with a 500 kg, as a lot of people will more than likely be coming in with the Eagle airstrike or possibly some type of barrage, and you'll have the 500 kg in order to kind of have that simplified answer for some of those larger targets and larger structures. But that being said, let's move over to the primary, secondary, and throwable, as well as armor. And when it comes down to our primary weapon, we're going to be using the exploding crossbow, which has been pretty much everybody's favorite at this point. It's one of the best primaries after this update. It's got the stagger, it's got high damage, it has a increased blast radius to it, and it is knocking devastators out of the park. It feels so good, and I believe a lot of people are basically throwing down their Punisher Plasma as it was just ease of use stagger with no damage, and now they're picking up the exploding crossbow and feeling what the power should have been with the Punisher Plasma. Even though the magazine may be a bit smaller and the fire rate may be a little bit smaller, that damage increase and that noticeable clearing power is much more noticeable and much more powerful and feels so much better. But when it comes down to the capabilities of the exploding crossbow, you will be able to two-shot any devastator as long as you get a direct hit, and if you're shooting the ground next to them or if they're caught within the blast radius of the exploding crossbow, generally it will take about 3 shots within that blast radius for them to actually be taken down with these exploding crossbow bolts. But sometimes it can still just be 2-shot if they're closely packed together, which can happen quite often with some of those bot drops. The exploding crossbow can do quite well at just being able to clear up some of those bot drops since everything drops together, and with that increase to that blast radius, it's very easy with one magazine to take out 3 to 4 of those devastators, as well as some of these smaller humanoid bots. On top of that, it will also have the capability of two-shotting a Hulk if you land those shots into the back weak spot. There is a tricky way to also 3-shot a Hulk from the front if you're shooting somewhere between their legs just towards the back end. The blast radius has been increased to the point where if you shoot between their legs in just the right angle, you will be able to get these little red crosshair hit markers that end up encompassing that weak spot into the blast radius. And sometimes it can be 3 shots, sometimes it can be 4. I've tried to replicate this more than a few times. It's a little bit frustrating to get it done. It's just one of those tips I'm going to throw out there. I got it done a few times. It may benefit you in the future if you don't have any throwables available or any other type of weapon at the time to be able to take down a Hulk. This is one way that you can get it done, but it's not always going to be the most reliable method to taking down some of those Hulks. On top of that, you will be able to blow up fabricators by shooting them in the vent, which this can be pretty beneficial, especially at a distance or just trying to move through some of those fortresses or bases and just clean up those fabricators. And you can deal damage towards heavily armored tanks if you shoot them in the back portion towards that softer armor portion. As it does have that medium armor penetration, it will take about 7 shots, sometimes more, depending on whether or not you got a direct hit or if you got a little bit of that blast radius on that back end. Generally, I'd say you're better off using something else in order to take down the heavily armored tanks, but if you're in a little bit of a pinch and you don't have any of those throwables, or if you just have that perfectly lined up shot while they're aggroed on one of your teammates, you can use the exploding crossbow to get it done. You will also be able to 2-shot any one of the Star Wars walkers or the Striders that you'll be facing off with, those ones now with the heavily armored portion of them and the rockets on the side, which can be some of the most irritating things to deal with. All you'll need to do is shoot somewhere near their feet or possibly in the side of them in order to take off one of their legs, and it can make somewhat quick work out of them. Sometimes it may feel a little bit clunky if you're shooting directly near the ground though, as for whatever reason sometimes it will take about 3 shots to take them down. So a lot of times I find myself just kind of shooting them in the side to guarantee that I'm getting the full damage on one of those legs, and that should end up giving you the capability of being able to take them down in 2 shots. And there are some moments where you may be able to get them 1 shot by shooting just underneath where the seat is, but not always is that shot going to be the easiest to make with the crossbow. And generally you don't want to be that close to get that type of perfect precision. Generally you just want to get that explosive radius taking out those legs and just keep it moving and keep your distance from those rockets. The exploding crossbow has definitely topped the charts recently. I know a lot of people are using this, and it has become definitely one of the better primaries to use right now, and I just can't avoid it right now. I just keep gravitating back to it, and it just feels so good to use. Even though there are some other options that can be just as fun, the exploding crossbow just feels like one of the better options right now, and the ease of use on this, as well as the damage and the stagger along with that explosive radius, just makes it one of the best in slot choices right now, especially when facing off with the automatons. But do keep in mind when it comes down to the heavy devastators, if you're hitting them in the shield, they won't necessarily get the same stagger that they will get from a direct hit to that soft metal behind it, but you will be able to still take them down with 3 shots. So if you're at a distance, able to land those shots, don't worry about the precision in that moment. The blast radius will carry the damage through and be able to get those devastators down before they get close enough to have that pinpoint perfect aim on you. There's nothing worse than that Gatling laser, and I wish I had some type of Sentry with the same capability. Now when it comes down to the secondary weapon, I'm basically at a toss-up right now between the Las 7 dagger and the Senator. There are times where the Senator just feels like it is the better option, but you can't really go wrong with the Las 7 dagger after they upgraded this. They've increased the damage by 50. It's basically what the Scythe was before when it comes down to the damage output, and it has a much longer time before it actually overheats. And if you're able to pinpoint aim with this towards the face of devastators, especially if they're up close and personal, which is generally when you're going to be pulling out that secondary, if you can land every bit of that beam into that face, you're going to be knocking them out of the park really quickly, and it can be extremely devastating. But if you're not able to hit that weak spot, it doesn't have anything more than light armor penetration, so in those moments you can basically end up wasting shots and possibly put yourself into a really poor position for possibly chewing through some of those reinforcements. Which is why the Senator sometimes ends up being the better bet, as it still has the capability of dealing damage towards the body of devastators, even if you don't have the capability of having that perfect aim. Because all it takes is just 1 shot from a laser of either one of those devastators or possibly some other unit that may be nearby to completely throw off your capability of dealing damage with the dagger. So that's something to keep in mind here, even though it is something that can be a quality secondary at this point. And when it comes down to our throwable, we're going with Thermite, as this thing has just a huge amount of damage to it, and the biggest reason for this is the simple fact that the Railgun and the Crossbow cannot take down heavily armored tanks all that well, and with the 500 kg, we don't want to just be tossing this out every time we see a heavily armored tank, but thankfully with the Thermite increased to damage all the way up to 2000, all it takes is just one Thermite to not only take out either one of the heavily armored tanks, but also the barrage tank, which is one of the most frustrating tanks to deal with right now, and seems to be one of the buggier enemy types that we'll be facing off with for right now against the automatons, as if you take out the bottom portion, the body of the tank itself, it will end up still surviving for quite some time even after it explodes and firing off some of those rockets even at you directly before it ends up just deciding to disappear. But thankfully with the Thermite, if you can land this on top where the rocket silos are, you'll be able to take that out in just one hit. And with the heavily armored tanks, no matter where you land that Thermite on that body of that tank, you'll be taking them out in just one Thermite. And that's almost indispensable, but at the same time, you can take out Hulks with this. It will be able to one-tap them. And when it comes down to the Factory Strider, two of them will basically break open the head of the Factory Strider, and this will make it a little bit easier to take down the Factory Strider with the Railgun with how much damage you'll have to deal. But I would highly suggest just using the Thermite towards the heavily armored tanks. And one key thing to highlight about the Thermite, if you don't have that angle on the vents of one of those fabricators, you can actually use the Thermites to blow them up. And one thing that ends up being important about the capability of the Thermite blowing up a fabricator is those moments when you have a stratagem jammer that's directly connected to one of those fabricators, and if you aren't able to get the angle on blowing up that fabricator, or at least you're not able to get the angle on that vent, it is very easy to just throw the Thermite over on top to just land on this fabricator, and once it burns through it, it'll end up just one-tapping that fabricator and blowing up that stratagem jammer, making life a whole lot easier for you and the team. The Thermite is the perfect set it and forget it type of throwable, with a crazy amount of damage. And when it comes down to the armor, I've been working with the armor passive of Fortified, which reduces our recoil when crouching and going prone, but that's not something that we're necessarily going for with this one, whereas the big thing about this is the 50% resistance to explosive damage. I don't know if anybody has used this recently, but this has been a huge benefit to my survivability when facing off with the automatons. I am getting ragdolled all over the place, but when it comes down to rockets or even just blowing myself up a little bit with some of those explosive crossbow bolts, I'm ending up taking a whole lot less damage, and it seems that there is some type of bug right now when direct impact is supposedly being considered as explosive damage, so there are moments where when I would normally get thrown into a wall, I would end up dying, but now I do have the capability of surviving. And one thing to even note on top of that is that if you do have the Railgun explode in your face with full health while you're wearing this armor, you will actually still end up having about 25% or at least 20% of your health remaining. So you will be able to survive the explosion of a Railgun overcharging. So it's definitely reducing the damage by quite a bit, and it is very noticeable if you have used the Fortified Armor passive. It is going to be a huge benefit to your survivability, and I would highly suggest using this. And this armor not only can benefit this build, but any build that utilizes some type of weapon that ends up needing a good bit of that recoil reduced. Especially something like the HMG, which I promise you this is a huge benefit. But that's going to be the loadout right there, people. Let me know down in the comments below if you've been using the Railgun recently or the exploding crossbow versus the automatons. It has been a powerful force, and this loadout by itself, I have had a strong amount of survivability with this. I've had several matches with the automatons where it has felt almost like a little bit of a breeze being able to survive. I've definitely been ragdolled around, but the capability of not having to get called in more than once or twice an entire match, even after taking some sustained damage or getting thrown into some of those sticky situations when you're joining some of those SOSs with some of those random players that may be of a lower level or just don't really know what's going on, and somehow still being able to manage and pull them along all the way to the finish line. You can't go wrong with a loadout like that that does have that capability of being able to carry, being able to sustain the players, sustain the ammo, and sustain the capability of just destroying any one of the forces you'll be facing off with against the automatons. But I had a good time with this one, and I do miss the laser cannon. It's still a powerful force, but the Railgun feels like it is definitely one of those weapons that has taken the top slot right now when facing off with the automatons, as well as the exploding crossbow, outshining something like the JAR 5 Dominator. But I would say that the JAR 5 might have its place within this loadout if you're not a big fan of utilizing something like the explosive crossbow, as it still has that stagger power. But let me know down in the comments below if you've been rolling with the railgun, what's your loadout with it, or if you've been rolling with the explosive crossbow, what's that loadout you've been rolling with against the automatons while utilizing that crossbow. But hopefully this has helped you out, and if you'd like to see more content like this in the future, hit that subscribe button, and if you'd like to see some of this content live, hit that link down in the description below. Follow me over at Twitch. We'll be streaming daily, and on that note, have a good one.